Hello? Is it working? Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's brilliant to see so many people here. And thank you to everyone who's joining us online as well. My name's Rachel South, and I manage the bookshop at Pushkin House. And I am so pleased to welcome Kristina Gorcheva-Newberry and Polly Jones for tonight's event. I'm just going to say a few words about the speakers, and then we can get started. Kristina Gorcheva-Newberry was born in Armenia and raised in Soviet Russia. She moved to the US in 1995 after witnessing perestroika and the fall of the Iron Curtain. She writes in English, which is her second language, has published 50 stories, and her works have been nominated for and won several prizes in the UK and internationally. Between Dog and Wolf is her first novel and was published in the US as The Orchard. Polly Jones is Professor of Russian and Schrecker Barber Fellow at University College, Oxford, and Deputy Chair of the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages. She's the author and editor of several books on Soviet cultural history and politics, and her next book, Gulag Fiction, Labour Camp Literature from Stalin to Putin, will be published later this year by Bloomsbury. She regularly talks on radio and TV about Russian culture and history, and she was also consultant to Armando Iannucci's film, The Death of Stalin. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the event.
Are you going to use them? Yeah. Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, for that really kind introduction. Really thrilled to be here. So welcome, Kristina, and thank you so much for your novel. I'm aware that some people in the audience will have read the novel, others won't have read the novel, and we are going to try very hard not to issue any major spoilers, while also trying to give a good sense of sort of what the novel's about and how it's written. So I wondered actually if we could start with your... Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah. Do you, Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to begin really by asking you perhaps to summarize sort of what the novel is about, but not necessarily what happens in the plot, but you know what were the sort of deepest concerns that you were addressing in the work?
So it's a novel about friendship and love and loss and grief, all the good stuff. So it's also about memory. And as writers, we have to think about memory. And memory is, I often think about it as being, it's always there. But it's not a guest in your house, it's a tenant who doesn't pay rent and he will never leave. So memory is with you everywhere. You know, you drink your tea, eat your crumpets, memory is there. You lay on the couch, it's there. So memory is very important because it takes you in the past. And memory is very powerful. It's silent, but very powerful, because it can make you cry, it can make you laugh, it can make you fall in love all over again. The people that are either gone forever or just gone from your life. So memory is very important. So this book is about that.
So yeah, so the novel, for those of you who haven't read it, is set. It starts around the time of Brezhnev's death, so in the early 1980s, and oh, what's that?
Oh, I like that. We can have a dance party.
Strange counterparts talking about Brezhnev era Soviet Union. So it starts in the early 1980s in Moscow, in Soviet Moscow, and it revolves around, as you said, friendship. So the friendship of these two girls, Milka and Anya, who eventually are joined in their sort of friendship circle by two boys who they're involved with. And then the story plays out and goes through the kind of glasnost and perestroika period, not all of which we see, which I I wanted to come back to. There's certain things that maybe you might expect to find in a novel about this period, which I think you very deliberately didn't focus on. So it's the story of the friendship, but as you said, also of the loss of those friends and how they live through this very tumultuous period. The second half of the novel then moves to the States and then to the main character's return to the post-Soviet period, so 1990s Moscow. And I wondered if perhaps you would want to read maybe just the opening couple of pages of the novel, just to give a flavor of how the story of these two girls, Milka and Anya, sort of begins. It gives a very evocative, sort of sensual picture of their friendship.
Milka Putova and I had been friends since the first grade, which was pretty much for as long as I could remember. She was short and thin like a sprat, and every boy in our class called her exactly that, sprat. She had small acorn brown eyes set too far apart and slanted, the result of 150 years of the Tatar-Mongol yoke, as she often joked. Her face was broad and pale, her pulpy lips raspberry red, especially in winter, after we had been sledding or building forts all afternoon, snow crusted on our knees and elbows, our fringes and eyelashes bleached with frost. We lived on the outskirts of Moscow and tramped to school together across a vast, virgin field sprawled around us like white satin. She'd walk first through knee-deep snow, wearing wool tights and felt boots, threading her legs in and out, and I'd trudge after her, stepping in her footprints. She'd hold and scribble our names in the snow with her gloved finger, Milka plus Anya. And on the way back, we'd rush to check whether the letters were still there. You want me to read? Mm-hmm. Milka's hair was dark gold, straight and silky, cut in a neat bob around her jaw. She shampooed her hair every day, and I could smell it when we sat next to each other during classes, the delicate scent of apple blossoms resurrecting our summer months at my parents' dacha. How we'd sauntered through a corn maze, the stalks 3 times taller than we were, fingering green husks, separating soft, luscious silk to check on the size and ripeness of ears. Or how we roamed birch and aspen groves and gathered mushrooms for soup, their fragile trunks buried in grass, their red and orange caps burning under the trees like gems. Or how we swam in the river, racing to the other side and back, and then climbing a muddy bank and drying off on towels, motionless like sun-baked frogs, bellies up. At 10, we hadn't yet begun wearing bikini tops or shying behind bushes while changing swimsuits. We touched each other's faces and shoulders and non-existent breasts, compared hands and feet, the length of our toes and fingers, noses, eyelashes, the color and shape of our nipples. We counted moles and freckles, mosquito bites and scratches, searching for hidden birthmarks, gray hairs, some sign of indisputable distinction. We lazed in a hammock, suspended between the porch railing and a single pine tree, or threaded wild strawberries on long straws and sucked them off in one ravaging movement, our tongues, our mouths, magenta foam. We carved our names into birch trunks, so fat, so mighty, our arms wouldn't close when we hugged them. We trapped crickets in glass jars or matchboxes, which we placed under pillows for good luck, setting the bugs free in the morning. We made wishes while watching the full moon like an amber brooch pinned low in the sky. We longed for prettier dresses and Zolushka's crystal shoes and a fairy godmother to turn our dingy flats into splendid castles. At the dacha, we opened the window and stared into the darkness coalescing around us. The apple trees were bearing their first tiny sour fruit. The trees swayed their branches and threw trembling shadows on the ground, and we would sprawl halfway out of the window to touch their young, tender leaves.
Thank you so much, Kristina. It's such a wonderful, evocative, sort of sensual picture that's conjured up right from the very first pages. It sort of plunges you into this world and evokes it so strongly. And actually, in those opening pages, and actually all the way through the novel, really, there are so many scenes set in nature, out at the dacha, there's a sort of timeless quality to a lot of it, as well as obviously their lives are changing, they're becoming more mature and so on. And I wondered how in the novel you kind of, as you were creating the novel, how you sort of thought about the interaction between those kind of more timeless qualities of sort of life in the countryside, and the sort of universal quality of adolescence and this sort of state that the girls are in, and this increasingly sort of loud drumbeat of history and politics that starts to make itself felt as the 80s go on and as their lives go on.
So because the novel started as a short story and had no politics in there to begin with, but I needed the backdrop. So that part was real to me because it all started when Brezhnev died, because the whole country, imagine a sweater, but an old tattered sweater, so you pull at the thread and it all falls apart. So that's the same thing. So I wanted a novel started with a friendship where everything is intact, but bit by bit, as those, and then it's really short time.
Yeah.
The second part is 20 years later, but it's a relatively short time, right? So it's less than 2 years. But when it starts unraveling like an old sweater, and their friendship as well.
Yeah.
But everything has to be essential. As writers, we only have words. We don't have anything else. I wish I were a filmmaker. I can get away with words. I can just do the images.
I mean, there's parts of it that are very cinematic, actually.
Right,
I think
but we have only words. And for literature to transcend time or become literature, become great art, which I'm not comparing myself to Virginia Woolf, but I always remember what she says. She said that, one has to study words, and one has to have words at her beck and call. Right? All the words in that language you have to know. But not only the words, you have to know all their sounds, all the connotations, all the associations, everything. And so to me, that's essential writing. And then so unless one is Nabokov, who read dictionaries for pleasure, it is very hard to know all the words. But I feast on words. I love them. So I often imagine myself in the darker times, which of course now it's also dark in that country. But like if you didn't have anything to eat, but you would have words. If you could eat words, you could be full. So that's how I work with words. They have to do everything. So you have to imagine everything. But how can you imagine if you don't know? And also, so I think I blame Tolstoy for that too. But I learned a lot from Shakespeare. Here's when in England I have to talk about Shakespeare. Because Tolstoy was so large and so prolific in many ways. But what he did, he allowed the reader to completely inhabit the world he's created on paper. And he created it in such detail. There was no room for anything else because he was a control freak. He had to control that world. Shakespeare was different, and of course the genre of plays is also. But there was so much left to one's imagination. And so if I could cross that, be half Tolstoy, half Shakespeare, which is of course impossible, but you have to have the sensuality, but also the space that allows the reader to connect to the character.
Yeah, I mean, there are moments in the novel where the characters do mention War and Peace a couple of times, which leapt out at me, as it always does. And I wondered if that was, clearly an intentional sort of reference on your part, but this is obviously in some ways a kind of novel about how everyday life interacts with big historical, political events, and to what extent they don't interact, or to what extent one can kind of keep your life sort of relatively free of those pressures. Was that a conscious, were you writing in dialogue with that idea of what, how does one write a historical novel? How does one look back at an era, which of course, is now really quite a long time ago in some ways, right?
So the most important thing when one is writing a historical novel to think that they're not writing a historical novel, because then they're terrified, they're paralyzed, that they're going to get things wrong. So when I was writing it, I didn't know. But did I do that intentionally? Yes. Every move is done intentionally on the part of a fiction writer. And if a fiction writer tells you otherwise, do not believe her. Well, unless it's not a very good writer, but everything is done. Everything is there for a reason. And I started with short stories, and Chekhov, of course, told me so much about writing fiction. You don't have any room for wanton details. Everything there is for a reason. So you can't use allusions just because they're pretty. Faulkner said, kill your darlings. You got to kill them all. But War and Peace there because the lives of those characters, in many ways, that life is War and Peace. But also Hamlet is there. Yep. So Shakespeare is there, and
they put on a production of Hamlet, don't they?
Yeah. And I often think about Shakespeare, that how he was obsessed with death. I mean, he knew everything about death. And that's why he outlived time and will outlive all of us. But everything started with people dying, or ended with people dying. People died in between everything, but we still go to those places, right? We still, I just recently watched Romeo and Juliet, the opera. So we still go. Why do we go? Do we not know what's going to happen? Why do we do that? And as writers, we go there. And I think, and this is what I, in many ways, tried to do. So, I watched Shakespeare in the Park, right? And people are sitting there, and everybody read this, everybody knows this. But one of the, let's say it's Romeo and Juliet, one of the first killings takes place, and people go like, oh! And I'm sitting there going, wait till you get to the end. So, but why do we do it? We know why, and I tell you why. So, as I figured it out, we don't mourn, like in Romeo and Juliet, what do we know about those characters? What do we know about their lives? We really don't know anything. We don't know much, right? So why do we care? And this is what I always ask myself, and when I teach fiction, I ask my students, why do we care about those characters? So why do we care? So we don't so much care when we lose them. We don't care about the lives we lost, but we care about the lives that could have been that we lost. And this is where Shakespeare is the greatest, because this is where we feel those lives with all the imagination. And we think, oh my God, they could have done this, they could have been this, and this. Now all of it is gone. So we don't mourn the life that took place on the page, but we mourn things that could have become. And so this is what, to me, when I was writing, I was constantly thinking about it. I wanted to be like Tolstoy. I wanted to give all the details and all the little things of their lives. And I wanted people to mourn, those characters. But then at the same time, I also wanted people to think what would have been later. The lives they could have had. The loves and friendships and what would have become of them as grown-ups. And so I want the readers, I'm sorry I'm manipulating the reader, but I want them to feel that loss of what could have been, which is for a fiction writer is the most important thing. We don't work with facts so much as with hypotheses, not what happened, but what could have happened.
Yeah, I mean, so for some of the characters, without sort of issuing any spoilers, that their lives are cut short. So in that sense, obviously they don't get to live the life that they imagine, but some of the characters survive, and this is something that comes through very strongly at the end. This sort of sense of who's survived and how they've survived. So I'm wondering, with the characters who do survive, what is it that they feel that they've lost, or the life that at one point in the book you talk about this life we didn't get to live.
Right.
What is it that prevented that in the characters who do survive? Sort of what vision of the future is lost as a result of what happens in the 80s and 90s? Because there is a hunger for change at the beginning, right? The parents are frustrated. The girls are obsessed with Western culture. They want more access to knowledge and information. But at the same time, the changes that do then happen don't seem to be good for anyone really in the novel.
Right. And they didn't get to see, or we didn't get to see as readers, we didn't get to see a little bit further if there was anything better, right? But you know how this Roman god, Janus, where it has two faces, right? So some people say, okay, well, the face that looks in the past is kind of sad and rueful, but the face that looks into the future is kind of hopeful, right? So, and at one point, this is what I did, right? So they're saying, okay, well, this past is a horrible thing. But at some point, I wanted to switch their faces. Because for my generation, as it turned out, the face that looks in the past is more hopeful than the face that looks into the future. And so you can see how that kind of played out. I was right, after all. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah.
It was one thing I found, well, the thing I found perhaps most interesting about the novel in general was this very kind of evocative, sort of sensual picture of, very late socialism. And, it's something that as a historian and literary scholar, I've read a lot about it, but somehow this did give me new insight into that. And there's been a lot of, as I'm sure you know, there's been a lot of sort of rethinking of this period because it used to be kind of just dismissed as an era of stagnation, nothing was happening, everything was just standing still or declining. And there's been a lot of, really interesting new insight into actually this is a period when a lot of change was kind of burgeoning and brewing even before Gorbachev comes on the scene. And I was just wondering, it's sort of, overall how you would kind of sum up, the 80s before the Soviet collapse, because it doesn't really seem like a stagnant period at all in the way that you write it. It seems to be a period when, but there is this sense of stasis and this idea. It's a very famous book that came out a few years ago about this period was called "Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More." That kind of sense that everyone on some level sort of subconsciously maybe knew that the collapse would happen at some point, but at the same time they were absolutely sort of not expecting it on another level. Was that something that you were trying to kind of conjure up, or that's that sort of feel of the period, I suppose, is what comes through so strongly in the novel?
So, because I write in a foreign language about a native culture intended for the foreign audience, it's a very peculiar thing because I have to think of that audience in many ways. Even though as writers, a lot of times some people say, think who's your audience, but others say don't, because they're standing right here whispering to you things that you don't need. So, but I always think about that, right? And I wanted for people who did not go there in the 80s, although my publisher did, thank you. But I wanted, especially in the United States, very little is known about that period of time. And people really are not aware of what did really happen. Because most people just woke up and said, oops, we won the Cold War. Oops, the Soviet Union fell. But they did not know the years in the process, what happened. But also, what did every day, just like me and my friend, what did we think? What did we go through? But there's one thing that I wanted, at least, I don't know, and I hope I succeeded. I wanted to show that there was so much hope back then, and also so much freedom. But to know that, you also need to know that you can be unfree. You need to know what it means to be unfree. You need to know what it means when your life doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the state. So the state has all the power over you. And so when at some point you wake up and this leader is dead, this leader is dead, this leader comes and says, okay, it's all now gone. We will build a new country. And suddenly we were just talking about, the first Playboy arrived on the scene. And people are like, wow. And in the movies, you start watching some films, like Buñuel, for example. You're like, wow. So something that's been, so you know what it means not to be free. And then all of a sudden you have that short, very short wave of freedom. But with that comes great responsibility And then with that comes something else, the utter lawlessness that sort of spread in the society and inhabited the country. Because I lived through that lawlessness. And if, I'm sure you read the author's notes, so I lost friends to that lawlessness. And it's sometimes I try to reckon with that. How do you, one of the authors that I admire, Viet Nguyen, who won the Pulitzer, so, and I actually know him, so he talks a lot about it. How do you not even explain, but reconcile your presence with their absences? And it's a very hard thing to do. It's very, very hard.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about kind of history and memory, but one of the, and you alluded earlier to the fact that this novel originated in a short story,
right,
which, hang on, I've got the title here, Champions of the World, which was part of one of your earlier collections. I gather that both the short story and then the novel were based partly obviously on your own experiences, as you brought out so well, but also on a kind of more sort of imaginary account of the girl who becomes Milka in the novel. And that you were, and I was very surprised, I only found that out sort of at the end, and I sort of reading it all the way through, I just assumed that actually this was your kind of closest friend, and that this was really, the whole thing was kind of very autobiographical, but actually a lot of that is more of a kind of imaginative projection,
right,
that there was this girl that you knew, and
right,
there were rumors around her. Could you talk a little bit about sort of how, because she's such a kind of flesh and blood character, I mean, it's really
right,
astonishing that so much of that is imagined rather than a real person who you knew well. So could you talk a little bit about how you kind of adapted that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because a lot of people think that Anya is actually me, and that But as I said, a fiction writer doesn't work with the particular facts. We work in this landscape that not what happened, but what could have happened. But also, I'm not writing a memoir. I often tell people, when two people argue, one is telling the truth, the other one is lying, the lie will always win. Because the one who's telling the truth is limited by that truth. The one who is lying has no such limitations. That's why I write fiction. That's why I don't write memoirs. It's that's just it. And also, I don't want my mother ever reading memoirs. Says that's not how it goes. Yes. So this gave me. So this is my goodbyes to the people I did not have a chance to say goodbye, right? But I also had the chance to imagine their lives all over again. So it's like a love letter, right? To a character who is mostly fictional, but who, for me at least, it embodies this other person. So that's how it all started. I actually brought, it's not included in this book, but in the paperback edition of The Orchard. Yes, there's an essay I wrote titled Homeland. So if we have time, I read a few pages. That's just how the novel came to be. And they asked me to write that essay just to expand a little bit on what had happened. But yes, so for me, I have to lie, I'm sorry.
Can I ask you about that's really interesting that you say that. Can I ask you about the portrayal of Anya's parents, who are very evocative figures as well, and in some ways actually seem to struggle more with the changes of this period, even though they also survive, and more than some of the other characters, but in a sense that sort of difficulty and adaptation sort of affects them certainly as much as anyone else. But again, was that, to what extent did that draw on your own family history, or was it again more of a kind of composite or a imaginary figures?
It's not, because my mother raised me alone, so the father figure is very composite. Maybe some, like my friends' parents, fathers, and my grandfather was very loud. But the mother, some parts of my mother's probably there, but my mother was so busy putting food on the table. She rarely commented on politics, just because she was very tired. She worked 3 jobs. She had no time. And, in the refrigerator, at some point, there were 2 carrots. And I was talking to a friend of mine just recently and said, remember how we had 2 carrots? And she said, and half a jar of mayonnaise. But you have to admit, my mother's a very forceful, willful woman. She's short, blonde, blue-eyed apparition. But she walks into the room, and she makes everyone listen, even though they don't speak her language. And she doesn't speak theirs, and they're still there, like, listening. So she has that presence. So Anya's mother has the presence. Like, she's a very powerful figure in the girl's life. But she's also very verbal in terms of how she dissects the politics and what the girls should do and should not do. My mother was not like that, simply because she didn't have the time. And she slept like 3 hours. I always remember, I said, like, wow. And I think now, as she's gotten older, my mother can sleep anywhere. Like, the moment she sits in the car, she's gone. And when people ask me, I said, well, all her life she only slept 3 hours, so now she's catching up. So this point is just...
I'm sure she deserves plenty of sleep, actually, at this point. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the main sort of intertext, really, of the book, which is Chekhov's Cherry Orchard, and you've mentioned a couple of times that the US edition has come out under the title of The Orchard, which, again, I only found out actually after getting to the end of the story, but there are so many ways in which the cherry orchard kind of runs throughout the piece. There's the dacha, and eventually, and perhaps we'll come on to that a bit later when you read out a section from the end, but the sort of pressures that come on the dacha and the orchard there, but also the names of the characters are sort of adapted from the play. They put on a production of the cherry orchard. There's all kinds of references to the cherry orchard that run all the way through, which I'm sure are all intentional, obviously, but I'm just wondering, to what extent you were kind of using, there's so many elements of the sort of plot, or certain elements of the plot that mirror that of Chekhov's play, but at the same time there seems to be this kind of irony about how Chekhov is actually kind of irrelevant to the end of the 20th century, or to what's unfolding in Russia in the late 80s and early 90s. So could you talk a little bit about that, because I found it a very rich kind of seam that ran all the way through the novel.
Yeah, I discovered Chekhov when I was already living in the United States, sadly. I was forced to read him when I was in high school, but I never connected to the characters. I always felt that they were from a different century, different era, and the way they talk, the way they move, and things like that. So to discover the timelessness of a writer while you already beginning to write, it's a very special thing. So I fell in love with him. Just how much he could say in such a short, just the short stories or plays, right? And again, contrary to Tolstoy, who had to fill all the space. And Tolstoy hated his plays, and he hated Shakespeare too. He just said those plays are just, there's nothing there. But that's what the economy of the space, and that's what attracted me to him, that in such a short amount of space, right, and just what, 80 pages, 50 pages, he could say so much. But also, I've loved the Cherry Orchard for a long time. I've watched it on stage everywhere. And what I find interesting about it is that it's all true. Every time I read it, I'm thinking, my God, like it's happened today. It's all true. So to me, it was important, but it started that I went back to Moscow, and my friends took me to a theater, and I was watching it, and I'm thinking like, oh my God, I've already had those conversations, so I know what those, and not because I've read the play, right? But it's just so familiar to me, and so that's how it moves in with you like memory, it just stays there. And some writers, you live with them, they're there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a character, one of the kind of major, of the four major characters is Lopatin, who is, in the novel is the most kind of capitalist, the most kind of rapacious, who adapts best in a way to the conditions of this lawlessness in the 1990s, puts the orchard under threat and so on. And he seemed to me to be actually much more of a villain than Lopatin in Chekhov's play, who, I think there is quite a lot of sympathy around Lopatin, as a sort of former serf himself, and that, he, in some ways, he's trying to kind of save the family in Chekhov's play, or to sort of at least alert them to what's actually happening. Whereas I felt in the novel that Lopatin just became, not so much in the 80s, but, after the Soviet collapse, was just this really kind of awful capitalist brute. I mean, is that a misreading, or is that it seemed to be in some ways that he was more obviously villainous.
He's hardened, I would say. He's hardened. He does have a moment of humanity, at least when he builds those monuments, for other. He does have a moment of, he does have grief. He knows how to feel grief, and loss. I used to think that empathy, and a writer must evoke empathy. If there's no empathy in the work, it's purposeless. But I used to think that empathy was when one can feel the pain of others. Well, lately I think that empathy is when you can feel loss. And Lopatin does feel loss, and that loss shapes his life. So he hardens him in so many ways. And I have said this before many times, that absences form and define us more than presences, losses more than gains. And so I think, can we blame Lopatin for who he became? I don't know. It's for the readers to decide.
I meant to say, actually, we should, perhaps this would be a good moment to actually...
Right.
Let me just find it in the... Oh, hang on, is this... Yeah. Where are we?
But also remember, Chekhov's play is a comedy.
I was good. Yes, I was. Yeah.
This book. Although I have some time ago, I've realized that I got it all wrong between comedies and tragedies. I was taking a screenwriting class, and they were telling us what is comedy and Aristotelian terms and what is tragedy, and I'm thinking, boy, I got it all wrong. All these years I've been writing.
Well, I mean, Chekhov was famously frustrated that everybody played it as a tragedy, right?
And
didn't pay attention to the fact it was a comedy. But
so maybe that's why Lopatin is like that.
Yeah,
he just didn't feel the.
So this is from very late in the book, where Lopatin is sort of trying to essentially buy up the dacha and the orchard, and they have a meeting about it, and Anya's parents are there, along with Anya, to try and protest against this.
My mother cleared her throat, coughed into her dry, fidgeting hands, which were really my grandmother's hands, veins like roads running toward her exhausted heart. When I think about my youth, she began, I don't think about the way I looked or felt, or how there was very little in the world that upset me or didn't impress me. I was just as naive as many of you. I believed in the future of my country, and I was contributing to it by doing my job and raising my family. When the 90s hit, we all understood that it wasn't enough, that the boat was rotten through. We were all sinking, no matter how fast or hard we pedaled. Granted, some of us were better swimmers. They made it safe to the other side. A few drowned. The majority are still floundering, hoping to reach shore. It seems to me that the duty of a good swimmer is to rescue those who are about to drown, to build a boat and not to steal the last tree limb. Think about it. That land, that shabby house, that half-dead orchard is my youth. It's forlorn, and it's poor, and it's imperfect, but it is mine. It holds all the memories that I cherish. It's the one and only thread that links my past to my present. Without that thread, I feel like I have no right to exist. that I have never existed in this world, in this new country. A lot of us feel we have no purpose. We're sorry, useless, discarded people, but we aren't empty, aren't hollow like the new generation. We have values and we have our past. Yes, it's heavy like a rock and we can't rid ourselves of it, but it's also like our orchards, which after a dark, wet autumn and a cold, snowy winter burst into bloom. And we feel young again, full of hope, walking between the apple trees down the long, curvy, moonlit path. When my mother finished talking, it was very quiet in the room, like now. Lopatin burst with applause. "Lyubov Andreevna, what a lovely speech, just lovely." He leapt from his chair and rushed to my mother, his arm draped around her shoulder. Next to him, she resembled a frozen starling in the leafless limb of an oak tree. I have known this beautiful woman since I was a boy, and her kindness and gracious manners have made me fall in love with her. I love her as much as I love my own mother. It's true. Believe me, Lyubov Andreevna. "Oh, such shit," my father said. "Cut the crap. Start telling the truth." "Indeed," others echoed. Lopatin seemed undisturbed, his face impervious. "The truth? Such a short, powerful word, isn't it?" He took his hand off my mother's shoulder, and she fluttered back to her seat, not looking at me or anyone else. "Who is this young man?" Aunt Carlota asked, her voice low. "He sounds frightening, but women must adore him."
Thank you so much. So just maybe a couple more questions, and then we can open up to any discussion questions from the audience. But I did want to ask you about the title, Between Dog and Wolf. So we've talked a lot about, you know, the 80s and the run-up to the collapse, and then the period afterwards, which is when that scene that you've just read out is from. And clearly, you know, as you explain, and I think the afterword, you know, you sort of deliberately didn't show the sort of moment of collapse, but rather the kind of surrounding things, the consequences of the events in particular, and also the anticipation of it. So could you talk a little bit about that which is the title, obviously, of the UK edition, how that sort of organizes the novel, or what role that idea plays of being in this kind of in-between time?
Right. So the phrase itself is French. Please do not ask me to pronounce it in French. So, but it was popularized by Pushkin first and Eugene Onegin. So we kind of grew up with that phrase, and my grandmother used to say it all the time. She'd look at the sky and it's dusk, and she was going like, "Oh, it's this hour between dog and wolf," and I'm like, "What?" And she said, "Well, you know, it's like when you can't distinguish shapes." But to the novel, it was important. There was a scene there that was taken out by my USA publisher, so where they actually talk about the dog and wolf. But it's dusk, right? So the sun has set, but there's still color, so kind of lingers. And the same thing with the regime. So the old regime fell, but it kept lingering. It's there. But also those years between dog and wolf, right? So the wolf finally, or the dog became the wolf, or the wolf just always was there hiding behind the dog. I don't know.
Yeah, well, Bulgakov, you also, there's this kind of refrain or motif of Bulgakov's Heart of a Dog, which is also really interesting, that sort of plays into that, or enriches that metaphor further, right? That at some point they burn some of that, which obviously... You know, it's a very evocative scene.
Exactly.
You know,
So it's there. Yeah. But it was just very important, and I'm grateful to my publisher here, who agreed on this title. I was very sad that my American publisher did not want to adopt that title, and as I learned later, I was telling some of my friends, they couldn't remember it. They kept calling it that Russian novel. But it was very, and of course my German publisher said no to the Orchard, because they said it sounded like the gardening book. So they don't want that. But they also didn't want Between Dog and Wolf. So.
But why did the US publishers prefer The Orchard, do you think? Was it deliberately a sort of nod to Chekhov, or just
it was easy to remember. I mean, they was very honest about it. It was easy to remember and made it sound a little bit more commercial, maybe, because they said that it's frightening and it's literary, and so they pick the novel up and people say, oh, it's that literary thing, and so they don't want to buy it. So it's commercial reasons, but I don't know how many people actually buy books based on titles, but I don't know anything about that business. My publisher here knows, but I don't. So that was, but there was a deliberate title, and I wanted that title. So I'm happy. And now the French publisher is keeping that title, I'm hoping, right? Yeah.
Maybe just one last question for now before we open up is sort of why now? Why, when you look back on this period now, and obviously this has been in gestation for a while and sort of grew out of your earlier short stories, but looking back on it from the distance that you do now, what about it has changed in your view, or how have your memories of that time changed, or have they? Do you think? Perhaps, I mean, you alluded earlier to, how Russia itself has obviously changed over the years. Has that affected how you look back on this period, or not really?
I don't think so. The only thing is that I no longer live in the past. So the book allowed me, I mean, the past is always there, and I don't mean like a crutch, you lean on. I mean, the past is like a rock you lean on. It anchors you in your present. And it's always there. It is my rock, but I know, but it is a rock. I don't live there anymore. And the past is it always wins in many ways, because it's large, and as we get older, what is ahead is smaller, but what is behind us is larger. But that past is no longer frightening to me the way it was when I first came to the United States, before I became a writer, before I had the means and the tools and the courage to write that book and to put that grief and that loneliness and that loss, make it palpable in the weight of a book. So that's how I treat it now. It's also my way of. So now I'm writing the book that is set in Appalachia.
Okay.
And so I feel like this book was my homage to my past and to the country that raised me in many, many, many ways. Not to my mother, but the book I'm writing now is my homage to the country that raised me in other ways. So, because I've now lived there longer than I lived in Russia. So I think that as writers we do that. We always dig in the past, but as long as the past does not become your present forever, because then you can't move forward, you're stuck, but the courage it takes. And people say, oh, it's so much work to write a book. Duh, it is. But the courage, you have to have the courage. Well, actually, I was babysitting. I'm going to go on a tangent here. I should write an essay. How I learned from The Wizard of Oz. So about writing.
My favorite film, by the way.
Really?
So just so you know.
So I was reading the book. I was babysitting my friends' kids. Yes, I do have young friends who still have little kids. So I was babysitting. We were reading that, and then I realized, my God, that's ingenious, because this is how you write a book. Those 4 characters, and it just dawned on me. So now I'm going to have to teach a class on that. But this is how it is. So if we think of those 4 characters, so so each of them wants something. So what does the one character, the tin man, woodcutter. So what does he want? He wants a heart. So the book must have a heart. It must come from the heart. It must have a heart, right? All that. So we have the scarecrow. What does the scarecrow want? Brains. So the book has to be smart in some ways, right? I mean, it can be very, it has to be literary. So, okay, so the third character, the lion, wants courage. You have to have courage as a writer to face the most desolate of landscapes and the most heartbreaking of events. You have to have courage to go there and to take your reader there. And then what does Dorothy want? She wants to go home. The writer must bring the book home, meaning to the reader's hearts. He must deliver the book to the
And you
readers.
have to have a dog, which you've done, so it's...
And we all want to go home. At the end of it, I mean, home means different things, but isn't that brilliant? So that guy in The Wizard of Oz, I was thinking he was telling us about the witches and all this Kansas thing, when he was actually telling writers how to write a book. So here you go.
Excellent. Oh, well, on that note. So, yeah, we'd be very happy to take some questions
Sure.
or comments, observations. Yes. Oh, yes, of course.
Oh, hi. You've already spoken really eloquently about the mother character and your own mother. And I was just saying, I particularly loved in your book the character of the grandmother and that sense of the passage of time and how they often looked at the older women and thought about it. And I was wondering how important it was for you to include that older generation who are kind of now lost to us, and especially stories about the siege and why you kind of felt that that was the story you needed to add into this story. Thanks.
Well, growing up, we spend a lot of times with our grandparents, and my cousin is here, my younger cousin, so she remembers that we all went to the dacha, and our grandmother was a nurturing. I mean, we have grandfather and a grandmother. They were both kind of nurturing people. But I would always remember those long, fragrant tea-drinking evenings when the three generations would sit around the table. And surprisingly, in those tiny apartments or the dacha, which was like half a house, as I say, Johnny was outside. So the table was surprisingly big enough we all could fit. It's very important because you learn, you see the way your mother treats your grandmother, right? So it's kind of a circle. So if you don't know the transcendence of those generations, if you don't know that the love that is passed along with sugar bowl is passed along, I always imagine this how people pass along love. I think a lot of it will be missing later. And so I'm not talking about self-love. We recently just ended a lecture by Elizabeth Gilbert on self-love, so unconditional self-love. So this is not that. I'm not talking about that. So it's very important having grandparents that I still remember. My son only has one grandparent, my mother. And I, she was diagnosed with cancer when I was pregnant, and I remember all I was thinking, I was telling my husband and my gynecologist, induce labor so he could meet his grandmother. And my doctor's like, what are you, crazy? No. So, but I remember that, and it's still like that in my family. My son calls my mother every day. He calls me once a week. So it's that. I think it's that relationship. You live within that relationship. You grow. You learn from your elders. You do not discard. It's very important not to discard things. I don't know how to live without that, and especially in the country that killed its citizens 20 million within 5 years. It's very important and precious to have your grandparents. Because if you think during World War II, the country lost 27 million, and then Stalin killed within 5 years another 20 million. So 47 million people gone in less than 10 years. You feel blessed and lucky. You have your grandparents, so you hold on, you learn everything they say. And of course, they will migrate in your fiction, because your world is part of their world, or their world is part of yours. So.
Hi, thank you very much for this talk. You've spoken a little bit about writing for the Western audience, about your experiences of Russia and Soviet Union. Could you elaborate a bit more about writing, like being a bilingual writer and sort of combining the two languages in your head as you write and like translating? I mean, the characters like speak in English in dialogue, but then obviously like in reality they speak in Russian. So how do you kind of translate that in your head?
So this is there's a term for it, and we had a whole lecture about it at Oxford on exophony. It's writers who write in the foreign tongue, and not that many of us really. So when I write in English, and I only write in English, I do not translate. I do not think in Russian. I think only in English. And so the difficulty is for those characters to sound in English as though they're Russian. And they are Russian, but they have to sound Russian, but in English. So that's big. They can't have American lingo. It's just, otherwise it will be nothing. In fact, I just read somewhere, somebody published a book, also a Russian-speaking author, but I think she grew up in the United States, and they were saying how, well, her book is, it's not about Russia. It's about Russia, but it's about Americans, because it's all the languages there. So I have to, but it also, it gives me so much pleasure to do that. And I can argue with my editor, because my editor says, change this. And I say, Russian people will never say it like that. Nope. So I can, it's a peculiar, thank you for asking that question. It's very hard because so now I'm doing something different because I'm writing in a foreign language about a foreign culture, for me, still foreign, right? Intended for that audience. So now I have a different thing. How do I not sound Russian? Writing about Americans. So this is a different, but you have to listen. You have to always listen how people say things. And also, the hardest thing is humor. Humor is harder to translate than anything else. So when I was at the university, we had one very, very mean teacher. So she would position us, our backs, like there would be TV going on, and so but we couldn't see what was playing, and so it would be in English. And so without seeing, if I don't laugh because something funny was going on, she'd say, okay, you don't know the language enough. You can't laugh at their jokes, you don't know the language. And so that's how we were trained, so that's very important. But humor is very hard. It's the hardest thing, because also it doesn't translate. So English, American humor is very different from British humor. British humor is very different from Russian humor. So it's all very different. So.
I actually have another question about the audience, if I may. I meant to ask earlier about, you described this as being about kind of yourself as being part of generation perestroika, and again,
right.
that we were talking earlier about sort of what was distinctive about that generation's experiences. Do you see this book as being partly addressed to other people of that generation? You were saying that it was partly to kind of dispel, wrong ideas in the country where you now live, sort of Cold War ideas about that period. But do you also see it as addressed to that audience? And what do you think they might learn from it or get from it? You were talking earlier about sort of it being perhaps in some ways therapeutic or a sort of exorcism in some way of bad memories.
Right.
Yeah.
I think, so I once had a reader who wrote to me, and she lives in Switzerland, of all places. She read the book when she first came out in English, and she said this, and she was my generation and immigrated pretty much the same time. So she said this thing. She said, I have so many conflicting feelings about the place I came from. It's like a long-term marriage. There are moments that you love and there are moments that you absolutely hate. do not tell this to my husband, but honestly, it's like that, right? When you're being, and so she said, this book, it's kind of a catharsis for me. And she said, you somehow managed to bring it all together for me. I'm not as conflicted anymore. And she said, it's like I almost forgave myself for living there, but also for leaving the country. Because a lot of us grieve that loss. Now we grieve it even more because we know we can never, ever go back there. So we lost it once again, and this time for good. And so it's, to me, that's very important when somebody can connect with the book. And that's, of course, that's empathy. That's what we're talking about.
And did you go back to Russia on visits, for example, after the 90s as well?
Yes.
So I mean, you talk a little. There are sort of some brief references to the Putin period in the book. I mean, do you see, you were talking earlier about the kind of 90s as this period, kind of bespredel, as kind of, lawlessness.
Right.
Did you, I mean, how would you kind of compare the 90s with what came afterwards? I mean, do you see that sort of lawlessness as having been distinctive to that period? Did you start to see things sort of changing on those visits back?
Yeah, I mean, there's even in the book when Lopatin asks the main character, how do you feel? And she says, I feel like I have no legs. So it's like, or you feel no ground. I've always felt that things were familiar, but very, very distant in some way, right? And blurry. There's also, the good metaphor for it is there's a movie by Paolo Sorrentino called Youth. It's one of my favorite films. But there's a filmmaker teaching a young filmmaker, and he's trying to explain to him all this process of crafting stories and creating and stuff like that, but also understanding something about life. So there's a big telescope, and it's projected, I don't know, like into the mountains. And he's telling him, look on this. And he's looking on this one side, and he said, what do you see? He said, oh, it's just far away. He said, man, that's beautiful. And he said, yeah, but see how far away it is and how everything is so clear and stuff. He said, this is it. Now he turns the telescope. He says, now look on the other side. And he does. And he said, what do you see? He said, no, it's all blurry. It's all this, kind of, really distorted. And he said, okay, so the first thing you see, it's you, it's your youth. It's how everything is presented to you now. But when I turned it, that is my life. That is how everything is presented from this side. So this is how I felt. That I'm looking at this other side of a telescope, and everything is that. And it's a very, very, it's a disconcerting feeling, because everything is familiar. You know the names of everything that's around you. Like you can read the language, but at the same time, everything is so blurry, and it's unreachable. You can reach, but it will never, ever again become this sharp, distilled, perfect image of that mountain through this narrow, scope of a telescope from this just distance, where everything is possible if you only look close enough. You'll see it. You'll see the leaves on the trees on top of the mountains. So for me and for my generation, it's no longer possible. That's how I felt when I went there. So I've gradually felt that. But then at some point, I don't even have a telescope anymore. So that's how I feel. It's gone. The telescope is gone. Everything is gone.
Would you say there are elements of nostalgia for the period that you described? Perhaps not the 90s, but for the pre-91 period that you evoke? Because in some ways it felt like a very nostalgic portrait, certainly in the first half of the novel. But
right.
is that not quite the right term?
Well, it's a nostalgia for one's youth. Like the passage that I read out to you. We're always craving that part of ourselves where we were younger, healthier, happier, we think, right? Or we didn't understand that we were not happy. Now we very much understand that. So that's, of course, but nostalgia itself is a very dangerous thing because it coats everything. with this, you know, how in the movies they do those sparkles, tick, 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 so you're like distracted from the screen. So that's what it is. It's very, very dangerous, but at the same time, it's comfort. And I'm amazed that so many people having moved away or living in the United States, I'm sure here too, they still speak the language. They still eat potato salad, olivier, and borscht and everything. I mean, they like, you want to go do sushi? Sushi? No. What kind of food is that? So.
What about Victor Soy, who is kind of one of the girls just absolutely love, don't they? But I mean, has that the sort of pop culture, the more sort of pop culture, has that also
and the culture of
its
bars,
attractiveness,
of great bars, you know, like Akujava and Rosenbaum.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my son, who is American, because my husband is American, he was born in America, he grew up in America, he loves that culture. I mean, he's like he associates him. He says, "I'm a Russian American." I said, "You're not. You're American. You were born here." But he loves it. He loves that music. He loves the films. He loves the bard culture because he's a pianist, so he knows a lot of songs and things like that. So, and it's very sad. I think we always think that, you know, you can't miss what you don't know. But apparently you can, because he misses what he doesn't know. But not all of it is great, you know, because he only saw that little part of it, that, again, with the sparkles on top. You know, it's like the birthday little cake, you know, just put little sparkles, everything is good. But we from the distance allows us to see more clearly, like through a telescope. But you know, at some point, that's it.
Any further questions or comments before we wrap up? Yes, there's a question at the back there. Oh, that's fine.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. I'd be quite interested in hearing about your relationship with publishers in the West, and maybe whether you felt any expectations regarding preconceptions of how a Russian writer should write. How a Russian writer should be writing, and what Russian literature should look like.
Well, I should say that so I come from a culture where virtually women did not or were not allowed to write novels. You know, we virtually know nobody from the period where I come from and before. So I think they expected Nabokov or maybe Tolstoy. And then when you have some Russian Armenian woman coming in and just telling them, this is how it was and we're going to have to do this. So maybe they're like a little shocked. But honestly, I think read The Wizard of Oz. So I think if you put the brain, the heart, the courage, and then take the reader home, I think it's not going to be any different from any publisher, right? And my publisher here, Susie, said you have to fall in love with the book. I think it's true about any publisher in the United States or maybe anywhere. Of course, I know sales matter, everything matters, right? That's why they changed the title. My book, there they said it's going to be The Orchard because it helps the sales. But guess what? The sales here have been better. so maybe it was wrong. But yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if it's. I think it's all a matter of love. It's just falling in love, whether you fall in love with one's writing or not. And because I'm in love with this language, so I obsess over the language, and to me, it's very important when someone says, "We love your writing," and think you can work on things, but the writing, can you change the writing? Can you make someone write more beautifully? Probably not. Can you teach someone how to love? We were talking about it today. How to imagine? I don't think so. But The Wizard of Oz.
Hi.
Hi,
thank you
again.
very much It was really lovely to actually meet you by accident before the event. It was
Right.
great. My name is Sasha, and I co-run a reading group for Pushkin House. And I can't remember. We chose this book, so readers choose what they want to discuss from, you know, books that me and Alisa, with a great privilege, offer them. And we often hunt for books because we want to explore what was happening, you know, in Soviet Union. We also want to explore what was happening in terms of colonization, in terms of repressions. We want to explore different things. Anyway, your book won, and I found it excruciatingly intimate. So for me to, as a facilitator,
Thank
to
you.
actually
We'll put it on my website, excruciatingly intimate.
because I was born in Minsk, and I was born in the USSR. I was born in 1977, and a lot of it, I felt like you actually like penetrated my life.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I, first minute, I had thoughts, oh, you know, is this some kind of, you know, are these ideas of like, you know, anyway, it doesn't matter because it was really, really personal. I don't really want to go there. But there are things in here that somebody of like my age, having come from there, takes one look at the cover and goes, "Иди смотри, that film is a killer."
Oh yeah,
Everybody
one of the best
who
films ever.
This is one film you watch and you know exactly what happened during that time. And then obviously the cover, the font on the kiosk, you know,
Right.
the songs that are on the tapes, something just catches me and I can no longer read because I just, you know, run away with my own mind and my own memories. Then I have to go back to your book. So and then I was like, oh, you know, how am I going to actually facilitate this group? Shall I call someone in? So for me to have an event here was very good because every time the question was asked at the group, it was like, well, you know, you can ask Kristina because she's coming.
Well, it was good for me too because I had an excuse to come to this fabulous city.
Yeah.
I love everything about the city, those buildings, the fact that so many wonderful writers lived here, and Dickens and Virginia Woolf and all that. Your tin crumpets, but as a New Yorker, let me tell you, I love your subway. So this is my reason to move here. So, and the book I'm writing now is an homage to Toni Morrison. I could have never written it, have not lived in the United States. So my agent here, Jessica, told me, the next book I should be writing is about, you know, being a homage to Virginia Woolf. And I said, yes, but for that I have to live here. Yes. This is my excuse, but please ask your question. I'm sorry.
Do you think I have a question? Let me arrive at this point. There were only 2 books. I just want to kind of tell you these things because I think I've been sitting with them for a long time. There's only one book that we read last year with the group that for me resonated as deeply as yours, and it was Ikstina's Soviet Milk. She's a Latvian writer. And so there are some other books that I want to propose to the reading group. For me personally, it's very interesting to see what other teenagers were up to. You know, I know it's a fictional book, but it doesn't matter. You know, what was happening in Moscow at that time, or what was happening in Riga, and what was happening, you know, compare it to what was happening with us, because we really didn't know what was going on with others when Soviet Union collapsed. There was no way of knowing that. So that was really like a great point. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop. My question was this. Tell me of that moment when you decided that you were a writer.
Oh, I think, okay, so as half Russian, most Russian people tell you they're fatalists. They believe in some omens and things like that. So it's been, I think, something has been chosen for me. I didn't choose it. I was getting my master's at Radford University, being introduced to the works of Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison. And I'm reading those novels, and I'm reading these women, and I'm thinking, my God, I mean, can someone ever be like that again, right? So, because I didn't read them in the Soviet Union. Well, Morrison wouldn't have been translated until not long ago, maybe 15 years ago, maybe 20. Not good. They should have asked me. So one of the professors, we had to write those little logs, and you know, after you read something and you write little things. So one of the professors came up to me and she said, you know, you should start writing. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, just write fiction. I said, why? She said, well, you have a story to tell, you can tell when, but your logs are very creative. You should start doing it. I said, I've never written anything in Russian other than poetry, and it was not good. And my mother told me to never, ever do this again. To never disappoint her like that. And I said, well, I've never, ever even thought of that. And I've just had a child. And I said, no, I mean, there's no way. I'm barely making it through this program. And I said, I don't think I can do it. She said, sure you can do it. Nabokov did it, Conrad did it. I said, yeah, but they didn't have kids. You know, I mean, they didn't have to deliver them. They didn't have to, you know, breastfeed them. And she said, no, you can do it. And what do you know? Became my life. So guys, I always listen to what my professors tell me. So she said, go to this person, tell him you want to be in his class, and that, you know, you'll be writing fiction with him and stuff like that, and tell him that I sent you. So I went, and the guy looked at me and said, what do you write? I said, I don't write anything. And he said, well, what do you mean? This is a writing class. You have to write 3 short stories by the end of the semester. I said, how long is the show? He said, 10, 15 pages, 20. I said, sure. And he said, you have never written anything. I said, yeah, 3 stories, I could write that. Boy, was I wrong. And that's how it all started. It did not start. I've never dreamed of becoming a writer. I've always loved reading. My mother forced it on me. At first, she said, you don't read, you don't deserve dinner. So it's just happened. But once I started, there was no stopping me. I mean, like, literally. I mean, my mother's like, honey, it's time to breastfeed. I'm like, no. She's like, no, you got to do this. So I was constantly doing that. But it took me 20 years to publish my first. I had the first collection of stories and then this. But before that, I had many, many short stories and essays and things, but I didn't have a book. And I won some awards, but still I didn't have a book. Which, you know, in the long run, none of it matters, right? None of the your biography, all your achievements, you know, in the face of eternity, what does it mean? Nothing. You know, because even in the obituaries, you know, it means nothing. Well, I mean, like my second, whom I call my second mother, just passed away, which is very sad. But at least I was there, so I could say goodbye. But she actually was like my second mom, because she taught me how to be American. I just moved there, I didn't know anything, and I was terrified. And she said, honey, we're not really that different. We all love a good meal and a good story. And that's all I've been doing, cooking and writing. So, but you know, she died, and her husband, and I know he's in grief, and one of her children and my husband went to do this obituary thing. And so it's a good thing they sent it to me, because they forgot her daughter, they forgot her grandchildren, and then they forgot the stepson. And I said, what were you thinking? And they're like, well, what does it matter? I said, what do you mean, what does it matter? But then I thought about it. And I thought, yeah, none of it really matters in the face of eternity. So, you know, like when somebody writes for my obituary, I would love for them to say, like, okay, she was born, she died, she raised a son, right? She published a book. She planted an apple tree. It bore hard, green, sour fruit. So that's it, because really my trees do bear that fruit. But that, you know, but that's what, right? That's what outlives us. That's what matters. But really, all those achievements where you know, all it really doesn't matter. So I never planned to be a writer. I never wanted to be discovered. I never had this road of thinking, oh, I will be famous, and I will make a lot of money and all that. Because it really, in the long run, you're right, because you cannot not write. I can't imagine my life without it. And somebody said, oh, you know, when I'm lonely, I write. I write to be left alone. So I go in that room so I can be alone. And because I find those characters much more interesting than anyone who surrounds me. I'm sorry. But that's why, you know, I rarely write about people I know, because they're not that interesting. But but your family always thinks they're there. And then they're like, don't you write about me? And then when they read it, they don't find themselves. They go like, what? You didn't think about me when you wrote this? No, I did not. And also, you know, writing fiction is such a liberating experience. It's a wonderful experience because you have, you know, control of it. But also, you get to do whatever you want. You get to sleep with anybody you want to, men, women, dogs, I don't know. And then you can commit murder, get away with it. I mean, I could sit there, you know, in fact, my novel starts with the thing that the woman thinks that somebody's going to die. And my husband's like, well, do you know who? I said, I do, but I will not tell. But in fact, it already changed 5 times who's going to die. So I have this privilege. So.
Huge thank you to Kristina and Polly for joining us. I enjoyed that discussion so much. And thank you to everyone else who's come and to everyone who's joined us online as well. Our bar is open next door if you would like to stay for a drink. And of course, we have lots of copies of Between Dog and Wolf downstairs. So yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.